The anime begins in a place called the Labyrinth of the Moon's Reflection, where an adventurer, Rentt Faina, found himself paralyzed after encountering a dragon. He thought it was the end, but later was surprised to realize he was still alive. However, upon looking at his reflection in the water, he discovers that he has somehow been transformed into an undead. Before this incident, Rentt had gotten up early that day because for him, only nobles, wealthy merchants, and perhaps scholars with rule-free lives sleep in late. His studious friend, for instance, forgets to sleep for days when focused on research. Rentt was born and raised in a small town not even on maps and currently is a bronze-class adventurer. Like every adventurer, he wakes up early to get good jobs at the Adventurers Guild, which offers tasks based on everyone's skills and class, including monster extermination, escort plant and material collection, and even clearing clogged ducts. Rentt greets some adventurers at the guild, reviews the day's jobs, but not finding any interesting, decides to continue exploring the labyrinth of the moon's reflection, as he used to do. Unlike most adventurers, Rentt worked alone, not being very skilled, belonging to the second lowest class despite being an adventurer for 10 years, counting training before that, totaling 20 years. Despite this, he managed to make a living by hunting monsters and selling magical stones and other materials to the guild, being cautious and having an emergency fund. And so, Rentt stops by the market to buy bread and then heads to the labyrinth of the moon's reflection. However, unlike other times he entered to explore, that day he found a secret passage, getting excited about the discovery and the idea of exploring an uncharted area, acting without any prudence, something essential for any adventurer. He explores the place hoping to find magical items and valuable weapons, but thinks he should earn some money at the guild just by reporting that secret passage. However, instead of going back, Rentt moves forward, ignoring the fact that he is entering a very suspicious and dangerous area. As we know, instead of finding valuable items and weapons, he comes face to face with the biggest monster he has ever seen, recognizing it as a dragon, although he had never seen one before. According to legend, dragons are creatures that can have many forms and sizes, and when Rentt faces such a monster, he can't move his body, being paralyzed because he knew that a simple solo adventurer of the bronze class wouldn't be able to face such an exceptional creature as a dragon. And so he becomes an undead and immortal monster, although easily destroyed by a bishop or priest through purification magic, due to being a creature that violates the divine providence that the dead should not remain in that world. Rentt wonders if that meant he had died, but since he still had consciousness and memory, he decides to keep hope and return to the city. However, upon further thought, Rentt realizes that it's a terrible idea. After all, an undead would surely be eliminated as soon as it showed up in the city, and despite already being dead, he didn't want to be destroyed. Rentt becomes desperate and unsure of what to do, but decides to stay calm and not lose his head, pondering over something that has no answer. Then he takes his sword and notices that the dragon has disappeared, but thinks it's better to leave that place anyway. And so Rentt continues through the labyrinth of the moon's reflection. These labyrinths are found all over the world and researched by scholars wanting to explain their mysteries because no one knows for sure where they came from and how they work, knowing only that there are various ones of different sizes and are places where magical items and hidden treasures can be found, as well as monsters that appear everywhere. Rentt noticed that the place was empty and deduced it was because the other adventurers must be in the labyrinth of the new moon, which pays more than the labyrinth of the lunar reflection. So he thought he just needed to wait for a few days for another lonely adventurer like him to appear with whom he could converse. However, with this, Rentt realized that being a skeleton, he couldn't speak at all. At that moment, another undead appeared, but it was just a monster like any other. So Rentt prepared to face the creature, but he realized that due to the lack of muscles, he was much weaker and would lose even to an ordinary person. Because of this, Rentt decided to face the skeleton carefully, but when he raised his sword, he fell, discovering that in that form he couldn't even lift his weapon. Rentt became desperate seeing the skeleton approach him, but fortunately, the creature fell on its own and lost a leg. The adventurer watched the skeleton trying to fit its leg back in place and thought that obviously a skeletal undead with only bones couldn't use sword techniques. This reminded Rentt that all living beings could use life energy to gain strength. He then activated his spiritual energy, finding out that he could use it even in that form, gaining enough strength to use his sword, returning to the fight just in time for the skeleton to fit its leg. And so Rentt easily defeated his opponent with a sword strike. Suddenly, a light appeared, illuminating the adventurer and the skeleton, and he realized he was recovering the spiritual energy he had just used. This reminded Rentt of a conversation he had with his friend. She said that monsters have a mysterious characteristic and that with time and experience they grow even more. The adventurer observed that humans also evolve as they gain experience, But his friend clarified that the scale is different, giving an example of a skeleton that in rare occasions can become ghouls, a process called existential evolution, one of the subjects she usually studies. Ghouls are also undead, with the difference that they have flesh and are more similar to humans, making Rentt think that with a cloak and a mask to hide his new form, he could possibly return to the city. And so Rentt sets a new goal, to become a ghoul, for which he needed to defeat monsters in the labyrinth until achieving existential evolution. Meanwhile, his researcher friend gives up waiting for Rentt and decides to make dinner alone. The adventurer continues defeating skeletons in the labyrinth, improving his mobility with the light, which he deduces has a healing effect, allowing him to use his spiritual energy in every fight. Then Rentt decides to try facing a slightly stronger monster. After searching a bit, he finds a slime, a creature weak like skeletons, but not to be underestimated because physical attacks are less effective against amorphous and liquid monsters, like it easier to defeat with magic. However, he doesn't have enough skill to use attack magic, so the most he can do is use utility magic to create fire. That means Rentt has to defeat the slime only with physical attacks. For this, there are two options: hit the creature's core or shred its liquid form to the point where it can't regenerate. However, he neither has the strength nor the skill for that, leaving only the option to spend his reserve of spiritual energy once a day, making the small slime almost like an archenemy for Rentt. The monster tries to attack, but the undead dodges, and luckily, Rentt hits its core on the first strike. Then he takes the magic stone and collects the slime's liquid in a flask because the monster can release an acidic bomb. However, after they are defeated, the acid disappears from their bodies and the liquid leaves the skin smooth, making the content usable for cosmetics. Rentt gathered all the liquid using various vials he carried with him and thought that everyone should pay for a few days at the inn. The next day, a girl named Sheila, who worked at the Adventurers Guild, carried out her duties as usual. A teammate asked if the new adventurer who had come by had managed to find a group because, based on the recommendation letter, she didn't seem to have much real experience despite being skilled with a sword. Sheila explained that there were no good openings for the girl, so she thought of asking for Rentt's help. However, since he didn't show up, she told the novice that she would introduce her to a considerate veteran if she waited for a few days. But as the girl mentioned needing money, Sheila informed her about the Labyrinth of the lunar reflection. The man thinks Sheila did well because, being skilled with a sword, the girl should manage well in the labyrinth, even as a novice. Sheila cautioned her not to overdo it. Her teammate found it strange that Rentt hadn't shown up and asked if he had taken any long-term jobs. Sheila denied it, explaining that there was nothing that would make the adventurer leave Malt. Meanwhile, Rentt noticed that he no longer felt the desire to eat or sleep, which made sense as he was now undead, and attempting to eat would only result in the food falling to the ground. He observed that despite facing many monsters, existential evolution takes time. Although his abilities had decreased when he transformed into a skeleton, he was almost back to his previous level, thanks to the defeated monsters. Rentt discovered that, in addition to his spiritual energy, he could also use mana and divine energy, even as an undead. He used the energy on the bread he bought in the city because, besides healing wounds and illnesses, it was useful for purifying water and slowing down the decay of food, allowing the bread to last for at least 3 more days. Hoping that after this time he would have a body that needed nourishment, Rentt decided to focus on achieving existential evolution by defeating monsters gradually and safely. He could handle up to 2 at the same time, but a group of 3 would complicate things, and if there were 4, he would have to flee. A group of 5 would be almost impossible to encounter in the labyrinth. Rentt hoped not to encounter such a large group since, in that case, it would be his end, as he lacked strength in spiritual and divine energy and had little mana. Despite not being naturally inclined to be an adventurer, he didn't give up, unlike most people who tend to leave the adventurer's life after a few years and return to the village for fieldwork or other tasks. Rentt trained hard every day, studied magic and monsters with his friend, and accepted any job, no matter how small, believing he would achieve his dream as long as he survived. 10 years later, he was still far from becoming a mithril-class adventurer, a class that had saved nations and surpassed gold and platinum levels, even eluding those with innate talent. Nevertheless, Rentt refused to give up on his dream, even though he had become a skeleton. So he faced the labyrinth monsters again, realizing he was stronger than when he was human. He encountered a slime, dodging its attacks and easily hitting its core, reinforcing his belief that he was getting stronger. Rentt decided to collect more materials to sell, thinking he was fortunate to find another clean slime because they become disgusting after absorbing something, making it impossible to sell the liquid in those cases. But suddenly, the light appears, causing Rentt to absorb his spiritual energy once again. However, unlike the previous times, he begins to feel something strange, and before he knows it, he was gaining flesh. Finally, Rentt manages to undergo existential evolution and becomes a ghoul, acquiring an appearance similar to that of a zombie, which he considers a significant advancement. Rentt thinks that if he keeps striving, perhaps he'll become an undead of a higher class, like vampires who are practically indistinguishable from humans. So now that he has more than just bones, Rentt attempts to speak, but all he manages are some strange sounds. However, he doesn't get discouraged and continues training. Rentt continues hunting monsters in the Labyrinth of the Lunar Reflex to level up. Now that he has become a ghoul, he targets creatures that usually roam in groups, such as goblins. He separates them through the rooms and corridors to avoid complications. With his new form, Rentt has gained muscles, yet he remains even more agile than when he was just a skeleton. His mana and spiritual energies have increased, allowing him to strengthen his sword and easily eliminate 2 goblins. In another part of the Labyrinth of the Lunar Reflex, a girl faces off against a skeleton with her sword. Rentt observes her from afar, realizing he hasn't seen a human in a long time. He decides it's best to stay hidden because his appearance would likely provoke an attack or escape. The adventurer notes that he doesn't know the girl and deduces that she must be a novice. He knows most adventurers in Malt, but since they can be difficult to deal with and often make fun of weaker individuals like him, knowing everyone's abilities and friendships makes things easier. Rentt continues to follow the girl from a distance, realizing that at least the guild must find him useful since, despite his weakness, retirement hasn't been recommended. The girl keeps exploring the labyrinth, and Rentt recognizes that her chosen direction isn't the safest, becoming concerned for her safety. Suddenly, a skeleton appears and attacks the girl. She defends herself, and Rentt notices that she received proper training but is still weak, needing many strikes to be effective. He deduces her fighting style involves dodging attacks and gradually defeating opponents. Observing that the girl isn't paying attention to her surroundings, Rentt sees her getting cornered. Despite the challenging situation, she refuses to let a skeleton defeat her and attacks with her sword. However, her opponent grabs her weapon, leaving her completely unprotected. With no other option, Rentt decides to save the girl. He attracts the enemy's attention, hoping she takes the opportunity to attack. However, he realizes she's too surprised to do anything after seeing a ghoul, so he attacks, splitting the skeleton in half, and then introduces himself to the novice. She panics upon seeing the ghoul approaching. Rentt reassures her, explaining that he won't harm her, and releases his sword to prove his intention. Only then does the girl realize the ghoul is speaking. Rentt seizes the moment to reintroduce himself and clarifies that he is an adventurer like her. She's surprised and attempts to repeat his name until understanding that she is Rentt. Confused about why an adventurer looks like that, she questions if it's some kind of disguise. Rentt explains that he actually died but continues to exist in a certain way. The girl notices that the ghoul doesn't seem like a regular monster and thanks Rentt for saving her life. He responds that adventurers should look out for each other. She explains that despite not wanting to, she needs to ensure he will try to attack her when leaving. Rentt makes it clear that he has no intention of harming her, but explains that he needs help. He tells her that he needs clothes to be able to return to Malt, and the girl understands that he needed something to cover his body and suggests a tunic. So Rentt hands over the money he still had saved and explains that she can buy the clothes and keep the remaining money. The girl agrees to help the ghoul adventurer and introduces herself as Rena Rupage, promising to repay the favor for him saving her life. And so she leaves the Labyrinth of the Lunar Reflex, giving her word that she will return soon. But Rentt notices that the girl was still very attentive to him, as an adventurer should act in the presence of a ghoul, and that anyone would report a strange monster like him to the guild as soon as possible. However, Rentt hopes she won't betray him and thinks that even if it happens, he'll find a way to handle it. After leaving the labyrinth, Rena goes to the guild where she meets Sheila, who is relieved to see the newcomer, explaining that she was worried when she didn't return after sunset. Rena says that a lot happened and that she has a question to ask her, but it's not revealed what the girl asked. Later, Rentt faces another slime and realizes again how much stronger he is now than when he was human, easily hitting a monster's core. He observes that his vision also seemed better, but deduces that it would be combat intuition, something not learned through training or study. The adventurer wonders if that's how the victorious see the world and reflects that it was necessary to become a ghoul to achieve this power. At that moment, Rentt hears someone calling him and realizes that indeed Rena has returned with the clothes as promised. He appears, and the girl is worried that he might be another ghoul, but the adventurer explains that ghouls don't appear in the early levels. She is relieved and notes that Rentt has improved his way of speaking, and he explains that he has been practicing. Then Rena shows that she bought the clothes and brought his change. Rentt approaches, but this puts the girl on alert. She realizes what she did and apologizes for still being scared, asking for a little more time to get used to his appearance. Rentt understands the situation and says he'll just look at the clothes. In doing so, he is impressed with what she brought. Rena chose a simple colored tunic to not stand out and that covers the whole body, similar to what mages usually wear. The girl is happy that Rentt liked it and mentions that she brought other things she thought would be useful for him, explaining that as she recently arrived in Malt, she had to ask someone from the guild to introduce her to the store's items. Next, Rena shows that she bought gloves and boots so that he could cover his hands and legs. Rentt is touched by her kindness, feeling like he could cry, but physically it's not something possible for his current body. Then he tries on the clothes and notices that it's easier to move than he thought, losing only a bit of visibility, but nothing that would prevent him from hunting 1 or 2 monsters. Rena comments that Rentt looks much more imposing that way, almost like a wight, and shows his reflection through a small mirror. But he observes that he will still attract a lot of attention if he appears in the city. After all, his face is visible. That makes Rena remember that she also bought a mask because she foresaw that he would need it. Rentt thanks her, and he analyzes the mask while she explains that when she first saw him, she thought he was some kind of rare monster, and Rentt comments that maybe she was right. Then he puts on the mask, but notices that it's stuck to his face in a way that wasn't normal. He tries to take it off but can't, and Rena apologizes, explaining that the item caught her attention right away, but she found the price strange. Rentt asks if the mask wasn't a guild recommendation, and Rena explains that she found it at a stall selling it for a surprisingly cheap price, only 3 bronze coins equivalent to 3 loaves of bread. The girl mentions that she even checked if the mask had any curse, but as nothing happened with her touch, she thought it was safe to buy, realizing now that she was wrong because the curse is activated only when you put it on. Rentt thinks he's really unlucky and tries to remove the mask with his divine energy, thinking that as his energy increased, maybe he could remove a basic curse. However, despite some reaction, it wasn't strong enough to take off the mask. Rena feels guilty for what happened and apologizes for bringing a cursed item. Rentt reassures the girl, explaining that he really needed a mask anyway, and since she reacted to his divine energy, he just needs to save money and ask a powerful cleric to break the curse. He approaches Rena to touch her shoulder, but thinks it's better not to do that. However, she holds his hand, preventing him from pulling away, and explains that she understands he's not a bad person and therefore is no longer afraid. Rentt thanks Rena but explains that she doesn't need to force herself and can wait for the day when she's really more accustomed to his appearance. She agrees and says she's sure that day won't take long to come. Later, they both return to Malt together in a carriage. There, Rena reveals that she registered as an adventurer in the capital's guild, but since there were already many famous adventurers there, she realized there wasn't much work for a newcomer like her. That's why they recommended she register in Malt, as it's a place with 2 labyrinths nearby. Rentt says it was a good choice, but is surprised that Rena got excited about moving to the countryside. She explains that she wanted to see the world get stronger and become a respected adventurer. He understands the feeling, but says it's better to be a coward since you only have 1 life. Sometime later, they arrive in Malt, but Rentt is hesitant to pass through that entrance because many people there already know him, and they would sense something is wrong when he shows his identity. Because of this, Rena suggests they go through the West Gate, a less used entrance. However, Rentt thanks her, acknowledging that without her, he wouldn't be able to get there. However, even though he needed help, he wanted to separate to avoid causing problems for Rena. If she were caught helping a monster enter the city, she would be considered a criminal and lose her adventurer license. Rena says she understands the danger she was taking in helping a ghoul, but she knew she was only alive thanks to him, and therefore saw no problem in risking herself to help him. As the girl insists, they both head to the West Gate. There, they display their night identities to the guards, but one of them notices Rentt's appearance and orders him to remove his mask. Quick on her feet, Rena explains that she is cursed and can't take it off. The guard inquires if that's why he talks strangely, and she clarifies that Rentt was severely injured after battling a monster. The boy plays along, showing his ear to the guards since his zombie-like appearance makes it seem as if he's wounded. Rena fabricates that he bought the mask to conceal the scars, unaware of the curse. They marvel at how unlucky the guy is, and Rentt suggests they can try to take off the mask if they want. So after Rena assures them it's safe to touch, one of the guards attempts to pull the mask, realizing they were telling the truth about the curse, and they agree to let Rentt pass. The knight thanks Rena once again for helping him but seizes the first chance to evade her, leaving her alone because he still doesn't want to bring trouble to her. Rena searches for Rentt everywhere as he observes her from afar, analyzing that her equipment is cheap but well-maintained. She's skilled with the sword, very intelligent and courageous, making him certain that the rookie will become a great adventurer, despite others with such talents leaving him behind. Rentt contemplates apologizing for leaving Rena alone when he achieves a slightly more human appearance, feeling guilty for having to do so. And so he continues his journey alone, reaching his friend's house because he needed someone who also has a past and whom he's confident will keep his situation a secret. Rentt tries knocking on the door, but with no response, he enters the house and finds his friend Lorraine sleeping peacefully. He wakes her up and she startles at the sight of Rentt with a mask. He He then removes his glove to reveal his ghoul hand. Before Rentt arrived at his friend's house, Lorraine was tired from working so much while waiting for him. She knew it was futile to search for the adventurer alone and thought about asking the guild to conduct a search. Soon, Lorraine heard someone knocking on the door and recognized that the knocking pattern belonged to her friend. This reassured Lorraine, and she decided to lie down to sleep, knowing that Rentt could enter on his own. She understood that something had likely happened to him, but she thought the crucial thing was that he was alive. After all, she couldn't have imagined that Rentt had died and become an undead. However, after he entered the house and revealed what he had become, Lorraine mentioned that despite studying monsters and magic, she had never heard of someone turning into an undead after being eaten by a dragon. She asked if the dragon was still in the dungeon, and Rentt explained that he didn't know but presumed it had probably left. Lorraine thought it was a very strange and hard-to-believe story, but considering her friend's new appearance, it was clear that what he told her had indeed happened. Rentt noticed that despite the circumstances, the girl remained calm, which he expected as she was an academic, mage, and adventurer. However, it seemed at that moment she saw him more as a subject of study than as a friend. Next, Lorraine asked him, perhaps cruelly, if he was sure if he was still the same person. The ghoul thought he still had consciousness and memories of his previous life, but as he had certainly died, he understood he couldn't confirm being the same person. Rentt replied, explaining that he couldn't say for sure, but she observed that the answer was very much like her friend, even though she recognized it was challenging to assert that he was indeed the same person. However, she decided to set that question aside for now and ask what he wanted to do. Rentt explained that he wanted to continue being an adventurer and achieve the coveted mithril class no matter what. But with his appearance, he couldn't go to the guild, and his friend understood that he wanted her to accept jobs on his behalf. Lorraine also thought he couldn't get a room at an inn and offered for him to stay with her for the time being. Knowing Rentt would feel uncomfortable staying for free, she suggested that in exchange for shelter, he would help her with her research, as no one had ever had the chance to study a monster that underwent an existential evolution. Rentt accepted the payment method as long as he wasn't dissected. Lorraine asked what kind of monster he thought she was, but then suggested she might need a bit of his skin and flesh. Later, Lorraine left the house to get Rentt's money with the magic stones and slime liquid he collected in the Labyrinth of the lunar reflection, returning with a good amount thanks to the quality materials he obtained. Then Rentt explained that he was heading to the three-pointed spear to find a blacksmith. As he walked in the street, everyone who crossed his path was puzzled by his appearance. Upon arrival, he explained to the attendant that he wanted a new sword. The girl assessed his old weapon and noted that it had been well taken care of but was at the end of its lifespan. Due to the damage, she deduced that the adventurer could use magic or spiritual energy. Rentt explained that he had both along with divine energy. The attendant was surprised, as it was very rare for a person to be able to use all three. She explained that he was the second customer they had with that ability. Rentt asked her to keep it a secret, and she didn't question his motives, explaining that it was part of the blacksmith's job to keep their clients' secrets. Rentt thanked her and handed over a substantial amount of money, enough for the blacksmith to make a high-quality new sword. However, the attendant explained that he could only pay half at that moment and leave the rest for when the weapon was ready. Next, she explained that Rentt would have to be patient because the blacksmith took pride in his work, so it would probably take a few days to make a new sword, and the blacksmith would likely want to talk to him a few times during that time. Rentt said that wouldn't be a problem because when the blacksmith wanted to talk to him, he could contact Lorraine. Meanwhile, Lorraine was at home researching everything she knew about ghouls, undead creatures with strong physical abilities that can survive even decapitation. Her books also mentioned that they prefer the flesh of animals, especially humans, and are usually found in labyrinths. Some theories say they are born from human corpses, and other records of powerful monsters turning humans into lesser undead exist. But unlike Rentt, in those cases, the victims lose their personalities and any human will or emotion. In other words, Rentt is an extremely special case that has never been recorded before. Lorraine remembered when she had just accepted a job at the guild, and an adventurer asked her to let Rentt, who was just a novice at the time, accompany her during a job in the Blue Forest as a way for him to gain some experience. She recalled that at that time, the world was quite dull for her, even though she was the youngest to achieve the title of Grand Doctor, allowing her to register as a silver-class adventurer. After receiving that title, Lorraine went to the nation of Yarlin without saying a word to the people around her. For some, she said she was there just to collect some herbs, but the truth was she simply had nothing else to do. Even without a life goal, she agreed to help Rentt and went to do her harvest with him. After some time searching, she found the plant she wanted and thought she should be careful to harvest the roots along with it. After that, she asks Rentt to bring his backpack to store the plant. He does that, and the girl is startled to see that Rentt had already harvested several plants, while she had only collected one. She observes that the adventurer, despite being a novice, knew he needed to gather the plants along with the roots. At that moment, Rentt spots a goblin watching them. The creature prepares to shoot, and he steps in front to protect Lorraine, instructing her to use magic on the goblin. She does so, and Rentt thinks that someone from the silver class possesses a different level of magic, but the girl disagrees, saying there was nothing special about her attack. Next, he hands a cup of water to the girl and asks if that was her first battle. Lorraine says no, but explains that she always has other companions or guards around. Then she realizes that she wasn't helping the newcomer. It was the other way around. Rentt explains that she didn't seem very experienced for someone of her class, and that's why everyone was concerned about her going to the Blue Forest alone, prompting them to ask him to accompany her as a precaution. Lorraine observes that Rentt knows a lot about herbs, and he explains that someone once told him that to be an adventurer, one needed to know how to read and write as well as study plants, monsters, and other relevant topics. The girl then notices that she doesn't know the newcomer's name yet, and Rentt introduces himself. Lorraine does the same and asks him to teach her what he knows, noting that he must have some tricks, as he not only understands herbs and monsters, but also knows how to navigate the forest. And so their friendship begins. Over the next 10 years, Rentt continues to strive every day to reach the mithril class, while Lorraine stays by his side, pursuing her beloved research. However, Lorraine realizes that she has changed a bit since then, and that she now understands that the adults were just worried about her. She recalls that she hasn't been responding to their letters and doesn't even know where she stored them. Back to Rentt, he thanks the attendant and the blacksmith Clope, who promises to make a good weapon for him. The girl hands a sword to the adventurer to use while his is being prepared, and Clope explains that it can harness magic and spiritual energy, but advises against using other abilities. Rentt thanks both of them and leaves, and they notice that the adventurer clearly has some troubles but didn't want to ask for help. Clope speculates it might be due to a curse, leading him to think that Rentt will cause trouble for others. Later, Rentt cooks for his friend, who is extremely grateful for the dinner. However, she asks if he isn't going to eat as well, and he explains that he doesn't feel hungry in his new form. Lorraine then explains that during the time Rentt was away, she reviewed all her books about ghouls, realizing that he is different from the others, likely related to his ability to evolve. This leads her to wonder what he will become in the next evolution, and Rentt explains that his goal is to become as close to a human as possible, defeating monsters to grow stronger until his next existential evolution. And so he returns to the moonlit labyrinth, where he encounters a man being attacked by a slime. Rentt saves him and notices a scratch on the man. After saving his life, Rentt continues his journey because no adventurer is obligated to help others in dire situations, and some people pretend to be in trouble to rob the adventurers who come to their aid. But such occurrences are rare in Malt. However, the man follows Rentt and asks to join his group. He explains that he just registered as an adventurer and can't even face his slime yet. Rentt explains that these creatures are strong, especially for sword-wielding adventurers. The man realizes that Rentt is a veteran, revealing that he is a cook with a restaurant in Malt, in debt and needing to earn 15 gold coins by the next week. He decided to risk his life as an adventurer to get the money he needs. Despite Rentt's suspicion, he agrees to accompany the man, even without knowing if he's a good person. Then Rentt remembers that he doesn't know if he is still the same person as before, feeling a bit uneasy about having a companion at that moment. Nevertheless, they continue together, and Rentt leads the man to the secret passage, where he was devoured by the dragon, as it may contain magical items that would fetch the necessary amount for the cook. The newcomer is amazed by the place, especially because his map showed it as a dead-end alley. They explore, finding only a small opening, another secret passage. The man asks if Rentt could make money just by reporting the location to the guild, but Rentt remains silent. The man acknowledges that Rentt wasn't the one who found the place and assures him he won't take credit for something he didn't do. Rentt, uninterested in glory, allows the cook to claim credit for finding the place but asks them to explore the other passage together. Thus, they pass through the small opening and reach an empty room. The newcomer decides to search for more secret passages, thinking there might be 1 or 2 treasures in the unexplored area. At that moment, Rentt sees a drawing on the floor and is puzzled as the man moves forward without concern, as if not seeing the same thing. Rentt tries to warn him, but before he can explain, the man is teleported. Realizing it's a teleportation circle, likely sending them to a lower floor with strong monsters or deadly traps, Rentt thinks the smart move would be to abandon the cook. However, he reflects that doing so would only make him a monster. So Rentt steps onto the teleportation circle, and after being transported, he sees the newcomer lying on the ground. Before helping him, Rentt discovers they've ended up in a boss room with a giant skeleton. Rentt attempts to attack the creature with his spiritual energy and then tries to use magic, but both attacks fail to cause any damage. He notices that the exit has also disappeared, being one of the rooms he can't escape without defeating the boss. However, he is still an adventurer who couldn't give up on a fight, especially since it was the only way to save his life and that of the novice. So Rentt uses his divine energy, unsure if his sword will hold up, as Clope had advised against using anything other than magic and spiritual energy with it. Fortunately, the sword holds, and he manages to knock the giant skeleton to the ground. The adventurer then rushes on top of the creature to deliver the final blow, eliminating the boss from the room with just 2 strikes. Afterward, Rentt treats the guy's wound with his healing magic, providing only a bit of relief as he can only heal superficial injuries. The guy is surprised to see Rentt defeat the giant skeleton and finds the adventurer incredible, considering it was a very powerful monster. Rentt then reveals that with the victory, he obtained a valuable magic stone and offers it to the man to pay off his debts. He is surprised by this help, but Rentt explains that it won't be for free. The novice says he doesn't understand how he could help an experienced adventurer like him. Rentt then shows a small part of his arm, explaining that he acquired that appearance after being defeated by a monster. Now he can't enter the guild or shops, so he needs someone to do that for him. The man agrees but mentions that it doesn't seem like a fair deal for Rentt, as it's a straightforward task. However, the adventurer explains that he also wants to eat and drink for free at the guy's restaurant whenever he wants. The cook agrees and is grateful to have received the help he needed to pay his debts in exchange for something so simple. He tells Rentt that he can eat there whenever he wishes. Next, the two prepare to leave. However, since the novice still can't see any exit, Rentt points in the direction they should go, realizing that the novice really can't see the magic teleportation circles. Even without seeing, the guy trusts Rentt and goes to the indicated location, being transported back to where they came from. Then Rentt also goes, thinking he'll have to explore the labyrinth another time. And so the two return to Malt, and the guy takes Rentt to his restaurant called the Red Dragon Tavern. The adventurer notices that the place is well presented and thinks that the reason for bankruptcy must be the taste of the food. At that moment, the cook's wife appears and is relieved to see that her husband is well. However, she becomes worried when she sees he is injured. The guy reassures the girl and explains that he's fine thanks to the adventurer who saved his life and healed him. Later, he shows that he also got the amount he needed to pay his debt with the magic stone he received. However, this worries his wife, as it seems suspicious for someone to help them in this way, and if they were deceived, they wouldn't be able to pay anything else. The guy explains that the adventurer is a good person and decided to help him when he learned about his debt. In return, he will assist with some things. The girl thinks her husband will have to do dangerous things, but he explains it will be simple tasks, including allowing the adventurer to eat for free in the restaurant. The girl is puzzled, as that was practically nothing compared to the help they received. Still, she realizes it's true and becomes emotional about finally getting rid of the debt. Afterward, the guy realizes he never introduced himself to Rentt. He says his name is Loris and his wife is Isabel. Then they thank the adventurer for all the help, and Rentt says his goodbyes. Loris asks to at least know the name of the person who saved his life. After ensuring they could keep it a secret, Rentt introduces himself, and Loris promises to call the adventurer only Sir to keep his name confidential. He invites Rentt to the restaurant anytime, as it will be a pleasure to serve him. And so Rentt leaves, heading towards Lorraine's house. Along the way, he senses something strange and wonders what he has become. When he finally reaches Lorraine's doorstep, he notices his vision is becoming peculiar. Upon entering the house, his friend asks about his labyrinth adventure, and if he remembers where she left the letters she received from the Empire, as not responding would lead to the door being broken down soon. As the girl looks at Rentt, she senses something is wrong, but he assures her he's fine and hugs her. Lorraine is puzzled and wonders if he's drunk, but then realizes it would make sense since he's undead. Suddenly, Rentt loses control completely and attacks his friend, biting her shoulder. She immediately steps back and asks if Rentt is still there somewhere. Then she notices his eyes reacting to her call and uses magic to make him unconscious. After some time, he wakes up, and after Lorraine ensures Rentt is in control, he apologizes for what happened. She says it's okay, just an unpleasant accident, and asks how much he remembers. Rentt explains that he remembers meeting a man in the labyrinth and finding him delicious. Gradually, this desire drove him crazy to the point where he couldn't contain himself when he saw her. Lorraine explains that she had anticipated something like this might happen since ghouls prefer human flesh. She then asks him to rest, as she had to use magic to subdue him. Before leaving Rentt alone, he asks to see her wound. The girl shows the injury, explaining she had just sold her potions to the magic pharmacy, but in the morning, she'll gather more ingredients to make a healing potion. However, Rentt decides to take care of it himself with his divine magic. Lorraine comments that she had never been healed this way before, noticing that divine magic causes a pleasant sensation. After some time, the pain fades, leaving only a mark, but Rentt continues healing until there is nothing left, as if she had never been injured, leaving the girl surprised by the result. After healing his friend, Rentt observes that he has improved in appearance, as if his body is only filled with old wounds. At this moment, he realizes that his mask has also changed shape, now covering only his eyes. Rentt thinks he needs to hide his mouth, and immediately the mask covers the lower part of his face, leaving the upper part uncovered. Lorraine notices that the mask, in addition to being cursed, also responds to the wearer's desires. Rentt tests it, realizing his friend was right, and she explains that it's rare, but she has heard of magic swords with a will of their own. This makes Lorraine think that if the mask follows the wearer's desires, perhaps it can be removed. Rentt tests it, wishing it to come off, and Lorraine also tries to force it off, but the mask remains firmly attached to his body. As he continues to be undead, the adventurer decides to keep the lower part of his face covered. Next, Lorraine notices that her friend is able to speak much more clearly and naturally. Rentt thinks he must have undergone existential evolution again, probably becoming the giant skeleton he defeated. However, he remembers that when he evolved into a ghoul, it happened immediately. Lorraine reflects and concludes that it might have been when he fed on her blood. After all, he stopped being a ghoul and became a ghast, a servant of vampires, which is weaker than a lesser vampire. Rentt wonders why he turned into a ghast, and Lorraine says that even for scholars, existential evolution is a complete mystery, just like the origin of labyrinths, although she has a theory about evolution. Then Lorraine asks if Rentt would like to know, and upon his confirmation, she begins explaining that, as far as is believed, existential evolution occurs when a monster transforms into a more powerful being. She recalls that initially he was just a skeleton, and then evolved into a ghoul, which was curious since there are other ways for ghouls to evolve, such as becoming a skeleton soldier, knight, or many others, although there are also reports of some evolving into ghouls. Because of this, her hypothesis is that Rentt is evolving according to the form he desires, as his will is to have an appearance as close to human as possible. Rentt observes that the theory makes sense but wonders if he should have turned into a vampire, which is more similar to humans than a ghast. Lorraine explains that evolution must work like the Adventurers Guild, where one needs to go through each stage as they gain power, only then reaching the final goal. She continues to explain that experiments with smaller monsters show they evolve into a form adapted to the environment they live in, gaining, for example, affinity with fire when living in a volcanic region or with water when living near a lake. Therefore, it's also possible that his evolution is having a passive reaction to the environment, although this does not negate her theory that this response occurs due to the monster's own will. Rentt thinks that if his friend is right, he will be able to evolve into a vampire and maybe one day return to being human. However, she believes it's more likely that only the first option will happen, not knowing if it's possible for him to return exactly to what he was. Later, Lorraine concludes that probably the next existential evolutions will require more than just defeating monsters, as he became a ghast when he ingested her blood. It's likely there's a special condition to become a vampire, although it's just a hypothesis. Regardless, Rentt will have to go through a long journey to reach his goal, and she promises to be there to help him in any way possible. Rentt thanks his friend, but she then switches to researcher mode and decides to conduct experiments on him, such as using magic to photograph his body for records and cutting a piece of his skin for various tests, as well as testing his sleep and appetite, now that he's in a new form. Rentt is concerned about the idea of undergoing so many experiments, but Lorraine understands that he was quite tired, deciding to leave the tests for the next day. So the next day, Rentt gets up early to train while his friend continues to rest. He realizes that the strange impulse he felt the day before has disappeared, and he has returned to acting normally. At this moment, Rentt realizes that he has worn out his sword faster than he should have while facing the giant skeleton, and it's not possible to take the weapon into the labyrinth in that state. Therefore, he returns to the blacksmith cloak shop to explain that he will need the sword he ordered as soon as possible. The man doesn't like seeing the state Rentt left his sword in, and the adventurer confesses that he strengthened it with divine magic. Cloak questions why he used this type of magic on the sword, since he doesn't need it to defeat any type of monster in the Lunar Reflex Labyrinth. Rentt explains that he found a giant skeleton in an unexplored area. The blacksmith is surprised but realizes that this explains the situation of the weapon and even the strange way the adventurer looks. Then Cloak asks if Rentt explored the area, and he explains that he will need his sword to do so. Cloak says he can't deliver it at that moment, but understanding that Rentt can't let someone else explore the area he found, he decides to lend another sword to the adventurer, one slightly better and more resistant than the last, as Rentt is one of his best customers. And so the adventurer leaves the shop with a new weapon, ready to continue exploring the labyrinth with the goal of achieving a new existential evolution. Along the way, he encounters Loris and Isabel, who are buying various foods to return to work at the Red Dragon Tavern. Later on, Rentt is going to carry out the experiments he promised his friend. Lorraine explains that a significant part of nature is poisonous, ranging from nausea to paralysis. However, by mixing substances, a new poison is created that can even eliminate a brown bear. Rentt starts to fear the girl's alchemy, becoming concerned about whether it was really safe for him to drink the mixture she prepared. After consuming the poison, Lorraine asks if Rentt needs an antidote spell, but he explains that he is fine and just found the taste of the contents horrible. Then his friend comments that perhaps he is the first person in history to ingest poison and survive just to complain about the flavor. She observes that apparently no poison affects Rentt, although herbs and healing potions work for some reason, making his body quite favorable to them. Next, Lorraine notes in her observations that despite evolving into a ghast, he hardly feels the need to sleep. Then she inquires about his appetite, and Rentt explains that he craves the flesh and blood of humans, albeit in a small and controlled amount. Because of this, the girl hands him a flask. Rentt thinks it's another experiment with poison, but upon opening it, he realizes it contains a bit of blood. Lorraine explains that she took a bit of her blood and put preservation magic in the flask to make it last longer. Even though he doesn't want to, it's better to ingest at least a little blood periodically to prevent him from losing control again. Rentt agrees and consumes a drop from the flask, celebrating the taste. Afterwards, he thanks Lorraine, mentioning that just that amount was enough to curb his hunger, and he promises to make the flask last. Then Rentt mentions that he intends to go to the guild to accept an adventurer job. Lorraine reminds him that to take on jobs, he needs to show his identity, and since everyone there knows him, they will have many questions about his new appearance. Rentt acknowledges that his appearance is indeed quite different, but he thought it wouldn't be a problem since he's just a bronze-class adventurer. Lorraine agrees that there are many others in his class, but she says that everyone will still recognize him because the whole guild likes him. After all, he did all kinds of jobs. Whether helping a newbie or taking on jobs no one else was interested in. Rentt says those were unimportant services, and Lorraine asks him not to downplay himself like that because the guild even wanted to recruit him. Rentt is surprised as he didn't consider himself a very talented adventurer. Lorraine explains that they probably found it challenging to bring up the subject since Rentt showed no signs of retiring. She is sure of their desire because she knows some people from the guild. Rentt says he indeed has no intention of retiring, and that's why he wasn't interested in working at the guild, but he's happy to know that everyone sees him that way. Then, Lorraine thinks that the best way for Rentt to accept missions at the guild without causing problems would be to present himself as a new adventurer. Since it's something that requires a personal presence, everyone would continue to think he is missing. And so Rentt returns to the guild after such a long time. He goes to Sheila to register as a new adventurer, and the girl hands him the necessary form explaining that he can fill out everything if needed, except for his name. Rentt expresses gratitude and explains that he can read and write, so it won't be necessary for someone else to do it for him. Then Sheila explains that he doesn't need to fill out everything on the form, but listing the spells and other abilities he possesses helps the guild to find missions for him. Rentt remembers filling out that form 10 years ago, and at the time he didn't even know what an ability was, so he only managed to write his name and age, which is very different from what he's capable of now, although his goal hasn't changed. When Lorraine suggested that he introduce himself to the guild under a different identity, Rentt was initially against it, as guild norms prohibit the use of different names. However, his friend insisted, saying they wouldn't find out, and even if they did, it wouldn't be a big deal. Besides, Rentt didn't have another choice since everyone would ask many questions upon seeing his new appearance, unlike a newcomer who wouldn't attract attention, no matter how strange. With that, Rentt admitted that Lorraine was right, and despite meaning he would lose his achievements and start over in the Iron class, he didn't mind. After all, his goal remains to reach the Mithril class. So at the present moment, the adventurer finishes filling out the form, stating that his name is Rentt Vivi, the same last name as Lorraine's. He hands it to Sheila, who is startled to see her name and apologizes for her reaction, explaining that another adventurer with that same name is missing. Rentt notices the concern in the girl's eyes, wondering why she's worried about someone like him, but recognizes that they've known each other for a long time. Then he asks if this missing person is named Rentt Faina and invents that Lorraine, his relative, mentioned his disappearance to him. The adventurer mentions that he's living with Lorraine, and Sheila remembers hearing that a man with an unusual appearance was seen coming and going from her house and becomes sad when she realizes it was Vivi because as Lorraine was very close to Rentt Faina, she thought it could be him. Then Sheila confirms the paperwork and asks for a minute to register him in the guild. So Rentt waits while reflecting that he did the right thing by pretending to be a relative of Lorraine's because he doesn't want people to invent strange rumors about her. After all, she's a young girl living with a man. As for his name, it was possible to keep it since it's common in all countries. Afterward, he observes that his appearance doesn't attract anyone's attention since it's not uncommon to find adventurers with that look when Sheila returns and hands him his registration as an Iron class adventurer. And so Rentt returns to the Labyrinth of the Lunar Reflex and hears two adventurers fighting a goblin. He realizes from their voices that they were young, probably newcomers. So Rentt goes to them and watches from afar to see if they need help. With that, he discovers a swordsman, Rise, and a healer, Laura. At that moment, a slime appears, but they show they work well as a team. Because of this, Rentt decides to stay away, realizing that it's not necessary to help the two because although he used to guide newcomers, he would only scare the boys with his appearance. And so, Rentt decides to go to the secret passage he discovered before someone else finds it too. After all, giving valuable information to the guild is worth money, especially about newly discovered areas, which means a great achievement for Rentt Vivi. Then he explores the place and uses one of the teleportation circles, which takes him to a room different from the others in the labyrinth. Rentt finds it strange that the environment has things like books and a teddy bear, and upon closer analysis, he finds a bed with a skeleton that seemed to be human, leading him to conclude that someone was living inside the labyrinth. At that moment, a girl appears and asks what he was doing in that room. Rentt observes that she seems dangerous and explains that he's just investigating the area to see if he finds anything because he's an adventurer. However, this makes the woman consider him a thief. She says she can't forgive the disturbance of that place and uses magic that hurls Rentt with full force against the wall, making him think that this might be the end. But with the attack, his clothes are destroyed, revealing his ghastly body. The girl notices his appearance, decides not to attack, and comments that it explains how Rentt got there. She then says there was a misunderstanding on her part and apologizes for burning his clothes, surprising Rentt since she didn't just destroy his attire but tried to kill him. As a way of making amends, she hands him a cloak she was wearing, saying it's better than his clothes. The girl explains that the room is special to her, and although no one can enter without being accompanied by him, the guy must keep the place a secret, including from the guild. Later, the girl notes that as an adventurer, Rentt wouldn't want to return home empty-handed, so she gives him an Acacia map, a magical item that automatically traces the places its owner has been. And thus, she finalizes the agreement for Rentt to keep the room a secret, and with her magic, sends him back to the labyrinth entrance. After that encounter, Rentt returns to Lorraine's house and recounts what happened. The girl wonders if her friend is under the influence of some potion to attract so many strange events, but notes that it's a common thing for adventurers. She then explains that the map Rentt received didn't show any sign of being cursed, although she has no idea how to use it, as the item didn't react to her magic, deducing that maybe it might have some reaction with its owner. Rentt tries using the map, and magically a drawing of the moonlight maze appears. Lorraine is impressed with the magical item and observes two arrows moving on it. Rentt places his finger near them, and the names of the adventurers he saw earlier in the labyrinth appear. With that, Lorraine and Rentt realize that the map shows not only the labyrinth, but also the current location of adventurers, along with their names, making it one of the most valuable magical items in the country. Rentt tries to make the map show another place. He thinks of the new moon maze, and instantly the drawing changes, leaving the adventurer impressed. Although he knew the map wasn't complete, as it only shows places the owner has explored, not revealing any areas he doesn't know. After that, Rentt asks Lorraine to check if the cloak has any curses, but she explains it's unnecessary because if there was anything, it would have been activated right after he put it on. Lorraine comments that she noticed the cloak is of high quality, as it possesses an extremely strong magical resistance at a level no blade can penetrate, making it better than ordinary armor. This leads the girl to wonder who the woman giving those things to Rentt is. Her friend mentions that she showed herself to be extremely powerful, having a strength level above gold-class adventurers. Then Lorraine says she wasn't only intrigued by the woman, but also by the room because that place signifies someone has the ability to create living spaces within the labyrinth. Rentt then comments that he's planning on returning to the room. After all, the woman told him not to tell the guild about the place, but she didn't mention anything about him not being able to come back. Lorraine says that's what he wanted to understand because clearly she wants to be left alone. Nevertheless, the next day, Rentt returns to the labyrinth. He reflects that he found that new area where he stumbled upon a dragon and became an undead, which led him to pick up a cursed mask. Rentt thinks that most people would feel sorry for his situation. These things allowed him to face powerful enemies as well as uncover some mysteries, which led him to become stronger, something necessary for a mithril-class adventurer. Rentt heads towards the woman's room, but upon arriving at the secret passage, he realizes that the entrance had disappeared, which means she doesn't want him to come back. At the guild, Sheila talks to another adventurer who is also worried about Rentt's disappearance, and they both hope he's traveling or something like that. Everyone was very concerned about Rentt. After all, he taught most of them how to be adventurers, just like Sheila learned to be a true guild employee thanks to his help. She remembers how the guy devoted himself to the maximum to achieve his goal of reaching the mithril class when suddenly, Rentt appears in front of her, making her startle at being caught off guard by his bizarre appearance. He explains that he wants to accept a job he saw involving 3 orcs. Sheila explains that that task is not recommended for an Iron-class adventurer because orcs are very strong creatures, requiring at least Bronze-class to handle facing a trio. Then Rentt explains that he knows their strength and tells her that despite his class, he has already faced several orcs. This makes the girl a little more at ease and entrusts the job to him. But she asks the newcomer not to do anything risky and to run away if the situation becomes dangerous. Rentt promises to do so if necessary. After all, he understands more than anyone that you only have one life. Next week, we'll have more of this anime as soon as the new episode is released, so go ahead and subscribe to the channel. And don't forget to hit the like button below to support this video. See you guys.